Some battles aren't fought with fists, they unfold in the silence between insults. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't heard from his daughter in weeks. Then one evening, tucked deep in the mountains of Northern California, he got a message. No words, just a clip, 6 seconds long. But it told him everything. Enough to awaken a code he had lived by and raised her with discipline, not dominance. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. A woman stepped through the front entrance of Crestwood High. Her footsteps didn't echo, they landed like soft punctuation against the institutional tile, each one precise, each one necessary. She wore a long brown coat, the folds still sharp from travel, and carried nothing but a rolled lesson plan in one hand and a slim silver stopwatch clipped neatly to the lapel. Her name was Dena Schwarzenegger, though no one here knew that yet. They only knew she was new, and at Crestwood, that alone was enough to be dismissed. The hallway was its usual rhythm of teenage noise. Lockers slamming shut, laughter with just enough edge to be heard 2 classrooms away, sneakers squealing across the linoleum like tires. But she moved through it like water moves through stone, unchanged, unhurried, untouched. Students glanced, did double takes, then looked away. Some expected her to fumble with a map or hesitate at the main office. She didn't. Instead, she turned left at the mural with the peeling paint and walked past the vending machines humming like background tension. She stopped at room 3B. The door had no name yet, just a strip of masking tape where one used to be. Dena paused, adjusted her grip on the rolled plan, and stepped inside. The room was stale with recycled air and smelled faintly of dry markers. One fluorescent light above the whiteboard buzzed intermittently, its flicker not a failure, but a decision it hadn't made yet. She set her things on the desk without sound, then she moved to the clock. It was off. Not by much, 8 seconds, maybe 9, but it mattered. She reached up, pressed the reset button on the side. The hands jumped, then settled. She exhaled once, slow and steady, then returned to the desk, laid the stopwatch gently beside her notebook, and aligned them both until they sat in perfect parallel. Outside the window, the bell rang. Doors opened, students shuffled. Some loud, most tired. It was a Monday morning kind of energy, loose and unimpressed. The first wave of students trickled in, paused when they saw her, then kept walking. No name on the board, no posters, no welcome sign. Just a woman in a brown coat, standing still as if the room had to align to her before anything else could begin. Ryder stepped in last. Always last. Crestwood's golden boy with nothing to prove and no intention of trying. He took one look at the woman up front, then slid into the back row without removing his earbuds. His friends Cole and Seth weren't in this period, but their shadow lingered. Ryder leaned back, raised an eyebrow, then waited for her to speak. She didn't. Instead, Dena walked to the board and wrote 5 words in clean, deliberate print. Discipline is quieter than strength. Then she turned, faced the room. Her eyes moved across them, not judging, not searching, simply measuring. When they landed on Ryder, he smirked. She didn't blink. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Miss Schwarzenegger. I'll be your English teacher." Her voice was level, not warm, not cold. It landed like a stone placed gently on a wooden table, solid, final. No one clapped. No one cheered. One girl near the front clicked her pen twice. Someone else coughed. Dena waited. She didn't fill the silence, she let it hold. "You'll be studying stories this year," she continued. "Not just the ones on the syllabus, the ones you carry too, the ones you pretend not to write." A boy in the middle row snorted, muttered something about drama points. Dena walked toward his desk, stopped precisely 1 step away, tilted her head. "You won't get points for drama," she said, "but you will get noticed." A beat. The boy looked down. Ryder shifted, as if about to say something, but didn't. He was watching now, really watching, and not because she'd done anything loud or clever. He just couldn't figure her out, and that made him nervous, because at Crestwood, unpredictability wasn't respected. It was dangerous. Dena adjusted the blinds. The room dimmed a little. Then she turned back to the class. "I expect respect," she said. "You'll get it in return." The second bell rang. No one moved. The lesson hadn't started yet, but something else had. Something that couldn't be named yet, only felt. What no one knew. not Ryder, not the students, not even the teachers who passed her without looking, was that Dena Schwarzenegger had been trained to hold a stance longer than most people could hold a thought. That she could read a threat in the shift of a student's weight before a single word was spoken, and that the stopwatch clipped to her coat wasn't for show, because she wasn't here to control the room. She was here to calibrate it. The second day arrived with less curiosity and more calculation. Crestwood High had already begun to adjust its rhythm, just slightly, around the presence of the new English teacher. Students still slouched into class with the same Monday shoulders, but eyes lingered a beat longer on room 3B. Dena Schwarzenegger entered the building at the same time as yesterday. Same quiet footsteps, same measured breath. Her coat today was a deeper brown, almost black. Her stopwatch gleamed under the hallway lights like a coin someone forgot to pocket. By now, Ryder Langston had run his analysis. He'd watched her for a full period and come up with nothing. No obvious weakness, no catchphrase, no smile that gave too much away. It annoyed him. Not in the way loud teachers annoyed him with their desperate attempts to connect, but in the way locked doors annoyed him. He wanted to rattle the handle just to see if she'd flinch. It started during second period. She had stepped out to greet the next class, one hand on the doorframe, when Ryder passed by a little too close. His shoulder didn't touch hers, but his hip clipped the edge of her desk. A coffee mug tipped. A few papers slid to the floor in a slow, scattered arc. He paused only long enough to look back and say, "Oops." The word curved like a smirk before he vanished into the rush of late students. Dena didn't look after him. She didn't sigh or scowl. She knelt calmly and began collecting the pages, stacking each one with quiet fingers. No wasted motion. A sophomore hesitated nearby, eyes flicking from the papers to her face. He bent down slightly, reached to help. Then Cole appeared, bigger, louder, grinning. "Walk away, kid," he said with the kind of ease that came from never being challenged. The boy withdrew, not afraid, just trained, and Dena saw it. Not the words, but the withdrawal, the interruption of kindness. She gathered the last sheet, straightened, and walked back to her desk. Then she opened her small notebook, the one with the stitched spine and the corners worn from use, and wrote something down. She didn't speak. She didn't mark a student's name, just the time, the exact second the moment had happened. Then she closed it, placed it back in the side drawer, and returned to her place at the front of the room. Mr. Abrams, the chemistry teacher across the hall, had seen the whole thing through his door's window. He adjusted his glasses, hesitated as if to intervene, then turned away, disappearing back into the comfort of neutrality. That too was noted. The hallway resumed its pulse. Lockers slammed, voices rose, phones buzzed like insects in pockets. Ryder met up with Cole and Seth near the vending machines, laughing about something that didn't require a punchline. "She just bent down," Ryder said, "didn't even blink, like a robot." Cole barked out a laugh. "Maybe she is. Maybe that's why she talks so slow. They forgot to code in emotions." They weren't the only ones watching her now. Other students had started playing a quiet game of guessing. Some said she used to teach in a military school. One rumor claimed she'd been a hostage negotiator. Someone else whispered that her father was a general. None of it was close. But each theory added another layer to the wall they couldn't see through. During lunch, Dena sat alone in the corner of the staff lounge, her lunch unpacked with geometric precision. Sandwich cut diagonally, apples sliced but never browning. Tea in a thermos that never steamed. She didn't speak much to the other teachers, not out of arrogance, out of efficiency. Every word she spoke carried weight, and most weren't used to that. At 1:04 p.m. In the middle of a vocabulary drill, a paper airplane landed on the floor near her feet. It had been thrown from the back, weakly, carelessly. She picked it up, unfolded it. One word inside, dime, no context, no name, just the message. She folded it again, placed it in her notebook, not for evidence, for calibration. She didn't call out the class. She didn't demand answers. She erased the board, asked the next question, moved on, but every movement had changed, slightly. Like the way a compass needle shifts even when no one's touching it. Dena was not measuring behavior. She was measuring thresholds, how far they thought they could push, how quickly the adults around them would pretend not to see. She was tracking the physics of silence, its velocity, its weight, not just the boys, the system. Outside, the bell rang. Ryder walked past her door again, just slow enough to be noticed. She didn't look up. But she did open her drawer, remove the notebook, and add one more line. Time 1:47. Action pattern confirmed. Reaction pending. Then she closed the book, locked the drawer, and waited, because the game had started. And she wasn't playing. She was observing the board. The last bell of the day rang like an exhale, a release of pressure that sent students flooding into the hallways. Lockers slammed in quick succession, voices overlapped, the air buzzed with after-school plans and half-finished jokes. Dena Schwarzenegger waited, as she always did, 10 minutes after dismissal. She liked the quiet that came after the storm, the way the building settled when no one was looking. She moved through the hallway like part of the structure itself, folder tucked under one arm, essays in hand, steps light but grounded. Ryder Langston was already in motion. Halfway down the corridor, pretending to laugh at something Cole had said, his gait too casual, too loose. Behind him, Seth trailed by a few paces, phone out, screen angled low, already recording. Not obviously, not stupidly, but deliberately. They'd done this kind of thing before, just never with this kind of teacher. As Dena passed the stairwell, Ryder picked up his pace. A jog, not a run, playful, just enough movement to blend in with a crowd that no longer existed. No witnesses, not really, just one or two stragglers by their lockers, eyes down, ears tuned to pretend. He timed it perfectly. As she stepped past, his hand darted out. A quick yank at the hem of her dress. Not enough to tear, just enough to lift. A breath caught in someone's throat, maybe the girl standing 2 lockers away, maybe Dena herself. She stepped forward once, papers slipping from her hand like startled birds. The dress settled back around her legs. Ryder didn't stop. He kept walking, grin stretched wide, Cole clapping once like applause. Seth lowered the phone. No one said a word. Not the teacher who closed his door just 1 second too late. Not the 2 juniors who rounded the corner and froze. Not even Dena. She knelt to gather her papers. One by one, calm, intentional, her fingers didn't tremble. She stacked the essays by subject, not order. Her eyes didn't search for anyone to blame. Only the page numbers. She stood, turned. The hallway was already emptying. The boys had vanished, their laughter echoing faintly down the stairwell like a victory song. She walked back into room 3B, closed the door, not with force, with finality. 20 minutes later, the clip hit tick-tock, 6 seconds long. Caption, "Our English teacher caught a breeze." It showed everything, the hallway, the grab. The stumble, a half-second of exposed skin, the scattered papers, and Ryder's grin. It was shared, reposted, downloaded, played in Discord servers, private DMs, even auto-played on the hallway TVs when someone connected their phone to the system and forgot to mute. Some laughed, some looked away, some didn't know what to do with what they'd just seen, but it moved, faster than anything Dena had written on the board. By dinner, it had 200,000 views. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. In a quiet house tucked between mountains and pine trees, Arnold Schwarzenegger received the link through an encrypted thread. No subject line, no greeting, just the video. He watched it once. He didn't rewind. He didn't pause. He didn't scream. He picked up the phone. In room 3B, the light had softened. Evening had drawn across the windows in long blue streaks. The air inside was still, like it was waiting for her to move. The phone buzzed once. She picked it up. "Hey," the voice said. She didn't speak. Just listened to the weight behind the word. It wasn't concern. It wasn't fear. It was something older. "Are you all right?" She nodded before remembering he couldn't see her. "Yes." There was a pause, not empty, just precise. "You know what to do." "I do. That's my girl." The call ended. Dena didn't move for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't pace. She didn't scroll through the comments. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, eyes resting on the whiteboard where the day's lessons still lingered. Discipline is quieter than strength. Her gaze shifted to the far corner, the metal cabinet. She stood, walked to it, unlocked it. Inside, a thermos, a spiral-bound manual, a folded white gi, and a pair of shoes wrapped in a towel that had seen years of mornings. She unwrapped them carefully, held them both in her hands. The leather was worn, the soles scuffed at the toes, but clean. Maintained, she set them on the desk, perfectly aligned, then sat again. Outside, the janitor's cart rolled by, a mop clinked against the metal, wheels squeaked. The world continued. Inside, Dena stayed still, not broken, not shocked, aligned. The classroom was silent now, not the silence of absence, but of containment. The kind of stillness that settles when something has been set in motion but hasn't yet arrived. Outside, the last of the buses had pulled away. The lot was nearly empty. Evening light slanted through the blinds, catching on dust motes that drifted like echoes. Room 3B had returned to its natural state, unwatched, forgotten, but waiting. Dena Schwarzenegger stood near the desk, hands at her sides. No tension, no hurry, just breath. She walked to the far corner where the metal cabinet stood. It was dull grey, with a lock that stuck slightly before it clicked. She turned the key, opened it. Inside was a thermos, a spiral-bound manual with creases at the spine, a folded white gi, edges yellowed from time, not neglect, and the shoes, wrapped in a towel. She unwrapped them gently. The soles were soft, worn in at the ball of the foot. The stitching had held. She placed them side by side on the desk, adjusted the left one slightly to align. Then she sat. She didn't need the lights. The glow from the hallway was enough. Her eyes scanned the room like a sentry checking for breach points, but there was nothing to guard, not yet. Her hand moved to the training manual. She flipped through pages without reading, notes in the margins, drill sequences. A diagram of body position. She stopped at a section with a smudged fingerprint, centerline stability. She ran a finger down the text. The words had never been for show. They were reminders. Her gaze drifted to the bottom of the cabinet. A small envelope rested beneath the gi. She picked it up. Inside was a photo, folded twice. A much younger Dena stood in the center of a dusty community gym, fists up, chin tucked. Her face was tight with fear, but her feet were planted. Behind her, towering in a simple black shirt and cargo pants, stood her father, one hand on her shoulder, the other pointing forward. Arnold wasn't smiling. He didn't believe in distractions. She remembered the day, 10 years old, third school in 4 years. A boy had tripped her during recess and called her something she hadn't known how to answer. She had gone home with scraped palms and burning eyes. Arnold had said nothing at first, just clean the cuts. Later, he asked only one question: do you want to become stronger? Not what did he say, not who was it, just that. She nodded. And that night, he taught her how to fall without flinching, how to breathe through impact, how to stand even when everything in her wanted to disappear. Back in room 3B, the desk light flickered once before holding steady. Dena folded the photo, returned it to the envelope, and set it aside. She pulled the gi from the shelf, held it in her lap. It was soft, worn in like memory. She didn't wear it, not yet, but holding it shifted something. She stood, walked once more to the whiteboard, erased the quote from yesterday, wrote a new one: control is quieter than anger. Then she returned to the desk, placed the gi back into the cabinet, closed it, locked it. The shoes stayed out. Outside, the sky deepened into indigo. A janitor passed in the hallway, didn't look in, didn't need to. No one did, not yet. Dena sat in the dark, not preparing for a fight, not bracing for another blow. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was centered, the way her father had taught her, the way silence sharpens when it's been given purpose. The desks had been arranged in a loose horseshoe. Sunlight streamed in through half-lowered blinds, casting long lines across the tile. It was literature presentation day, and most of the students in room 3B looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Some clutched flash drives. Others scribbled last-minute notes onto crumpled papers. A few tried to hide their nervousness under jokes. Dena Schwarzenegger stood to the side, not at the front, clipboard in hand, eyes moving across the room without urgency. She wasn't watching the clock. She was watching them. The first 2 presentations passed without incident. A short story inspired by Of Mice and Men. A photo collage tying Gatsby's parties to influencer culture. The class offered polite claps, glances at the floor, sighs of relief. Then came Emily. She stood slowly, binder held tight to her chest. Her hair was pulled back the same way it always was, but today there was something different in the set of her shoulders. She stepped to the front, opened the binder. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I chose to respond to Jane Eyre," she said, "not because I liked it, but because it made me angry." That caught a few heads. Dena didn't move. Emily flipped the page. "I got tired of stories where girls survive by staying silent. I wanted to write one where silence ends." The room stilled, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A few students looked up. Someone stopped fidgeting. Emily began reading her piece, a monologue from the perspective of a girl at a modern boarding school, processing humiliation through literature. Her voice gained weight with each sentence, not louder, just more certain. Then Ryder coughed. Loud. "Deliberate, God," he said, dragging the word out. "You people take everything so personally. It's a book, not a trauma support group." Emily faltered. Her mouth hung open for a beat, then closed again. Her eyes dropped to the page. Her knuckles tightened around the binder. Dena stepped forward, not fast, not rushed, just a shift in space, a realignment. Ryder leaned back, arms wide, smirk intact. "It's okay," he said, mock gentle. "She's clearly been waiting all year to cry in public." From behind him, Cole laughed. Seth smirked without lifting his eyes from his phone. Dena's voice came level, precise. "Return to your seat." Ryder stayed where he was. "I'm just saying. Return to your seat." This time her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise, but something in the room tightened. Chairs stopped squeaking. Pens stopped tapping. Even Seth glanced up. Ryder hesitated, then sat back, not with a bang, but with the uneasy grace of someone who expected to be carried and wasn't. Emily looked up. Dena didn't speak to her, didn't offer comfort, just looked, and in that look something shifted. Emily adjusted the binder. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "I wrote this," she said, "because I got tired of being quiet. Because I thought maybe, if someone else stayed standing, I could too." She looked toward Dena, not for approval, but for grounding, and what she saw wasn't encouragement. It was presence, full, focused, unyielding. Emily turned back to the class. Continued reading. The rest of the monologue spilled out like something that had waited too long to be spoken. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. It was real. When she finished, no one laughed. No one moved. Dena nodded once. "Thank you," she said. Emily returned to her seat. Her steps weren't faster than before, but they weren't smaller either. In the back row, Ryder stared at the floor. Cole had gone quiet. Seth was still holding his phone, but the record button had never been pressed. Later, when class ended and students began to shuffle out, Emily lingered. She waited until the room was nearly empty. Then she turned to Dena and said quietly, "I didn't think I could do that, but you didn't yell, you didn't push, you just stayed." Dena didn't smile. She didn't need to. "Staying is a choice," she said. Emily nodded. And this time she walked out with her head level. Outside, the hallway noise resumed. But inside room 3B, something had opened. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough for someone to step through. It was third period on a Thursday, and the clouds outside hung low over Crestwood High like a ceiling that had forgotten how to lift. Room 3B was quieter than usual. Not tense, not bored, just still. The kind of stillness that made people sit straighter without knowing why. Dena Schwarzenegger stood at the board, mid-lesson, writing out a passage from a short story on unreliable narrators. Her handwriting was as measured as her speech. Clean, balanced, exact. Some students took notes, others stared out the window, but all of them, whether they knew it or not, were listening. In the back row, Ryder Langston spun a pencil slowly between his fingers. He hadn't spoken all class, not since his last joke had landed with silence instead of laughter. Dena had returned his essay earlier that week with a single note at the bottom, missing voice. He hadn't asked what it meant. Now he sat up straighter. His chair creaked. No one reacted, not yet, but heads began to tilt. A girl near the window shifted in her seat. Seth glanced up from his phone. Cole leaned forward a little too far. The signs were there. This was the prelude. The room could feel it. Dena finished her sentence, capped the marker, and turned. Ryder stood. "Nice dress today, Miss Schwarzenegger," he said. "Hope it holds up better than the last one." It wasn't a laugh line. It wasn't even original, but the intention was clear. A few students looked down. A boy coughed into his sleeve. The space between Ryder and the front of the room narrowed with each step. Dena didn't move. Ryder continued, voice still light, too light. You don't like jokes? I thought we were all friends here. He gestured toward the class with mock innocence. Some students froze, others watched. Seth raised his phone just slightly. Ryder took another step, now close enough that his presence became pressure. You know, he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it more dangerous, I think maybe you liked the attention. Dena moved. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud. There was no sharp intake of breath, no dramatic pivot, just a quiet shift of weight, a turn of her body, a guiding of his arm, one hand at the wrist, the other just above the elbow. The motion was smooth, circular, invisible to anyone not trained to see it. To everyone else, it looked like Ryder tripped over his own balance. His feet tangled behind a desk leg. His body rotated sideways. He stumbled once, then again, then landed, hard, into the plastic chair he had stood from just seconds before. The room inhaled. A pen dropped. A gasp started and didn't finish. Seth's phone was raised but unmoving. No one had hit record. Dena stepped back, one step, no more. She turned to the board and uncapped the marker again. In the space beneath the earlier passage, she wrote slowly, deliberately, "Power never needs to announce itself." She recapped the marker, faced the class. "Let's continue." No one spoke. No one laughed. Ryder sat motionless, his hands gripping the edges of the chair as if anchoring himself to something. His face wasn't angry, it was confused. Not at what had happened, but at how it had happened. Cole looked away. Seth lowered his phone. The silence wasn't awkward, it was clarity. The rest of the class passed like a held breath. Students took notes without whispering. Pages turned softly. No eyes drifted to the back. Everyone looked forward. Ryder didn't speak again. He remained seated, his posture too straight, like someone had taken something from him and replaced it with silence. When the bell rang, they packed up quietly. A few lingered. A few avoided eye contact. No one asked questions. Dena erased the board, picked up the papers from her desk. She didn't glance at Ryder, didn't walk faster, didn't look for phones or administrators. She didn't need to. Because what had happened didn't need documentation. It didn't need proof. It had entered the collective memory of that room like a fault line, unseen, but forever altering the terrain. Outside, the hallway resumed its usual noise. But inside room 3B, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. 3 days after the fall in room 3B, the building felt different, not in any way you could name. Not in the bell schedule or the announcements or the cafeteria menu, but in the small shifts, the way laughter didn't echo as harshly down the halls, the way some students glanced before speaking, the way chairs scraped a little softer against the floor. Ryder Langston still came to class, but he came quietly. He no longer leaned back in his chair or tossed out casual insults. His smirk had dulled, not out of fear, but disorientation. Power had changed hands and he couldn't trace how. In the library, Emily sat at her usual table, sketching in the margins of her notes. A younger student approached, awkward, holding a book with too many post-it tabs. As she passed, 2 boys near the back whispered something, pointed. The younger girl faltered. Emily looked up. "Don't." The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It landed with the weight of someone who had learned what silence costs. The boys turned away. The younger girl sat down, and for the first time that week, she kept her book open. In the courtyard, Cole and Seth sat on the low wall near the flagpole. Seth scrolled his phone, eyes unfocused. Cole said something under his breath that once would have gotten a laugh. This time, Seth didn't respond. Across the lawn, Dena passed on her way to the staff lounge. Neither of them said a word. That afternoon, Dena found a small envelope tucked inside her desk drawer. No name, just folded paper, cream-colored, with a single sentence written in precise, italic handwriting. "Strength isn't what you show, it's what you protect." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She ran her thumb gently across the edge, then folded it again and slid it between the pages of her notebook. The next morning, something else had changed. At the front of room 3B, just beside the whiteboard, a small metal plaque had been installed. No fanfare, no announcement. It was screwed in low, near eye level when seated. The lettering was clean, unpolished, the kind used for things that were meant to last. Strength isn't what you show, it's what you protect. Dena looked at it for a long moment before class began. The N in the word is curled slightly at the top. It was a curve she knew, the same way her father used to sign grocery notes. It was all the confirmation she would ever need. Students began to file in. Some glanced at the plaque, some didn't. Emily took her seat early. She didn't speak. But she placed her sketchbook open on the desk, lines of graphite tracing a new piece, two figures standing side by side, not touching, but holding the same ground. Dena adjusted the blinds. The light shifted. She erased the board. Wrote a single line. Literature doesn't change the world. It changes the person who does. She turned. The room was ready. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath held between movements. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had been declared. But something had begun. Not loud, not fast, but real. And from that point forward, no one in room 3B would ever mistake silence for absence again. Monday morning returned with the same grey light, the same hum of hallway lights, the same smell of too warm radiator air and cafeteria grease. But Crestwood High wasn't the same, not really, not in the ways that counted. The difference wasn't loud, it was quiet. It was where people chose to stand. It was in who looked up first when someone laughed too sharply. It was in who didn't. Ryder Langston walked into room 3B without a word. No headphones, no swagger. His hoodie looked too clean, like it hadn't been worn before. He moved to his usual seat in the back row, but this time he didn't lean back. He sat straight, not rigid, just present. He didn't scan the room for attention. He didn't bring his phone out. He didn't speak. Emily noticed. So did Seth, who sat 2 rows ahead and pretended not to. Cole wasn't in class that period. He hadn't been for days. Dena Schwarzenegger stood at the front of the room, already mid-lesson. The board was filled with neat lines of notes, underlined phrases from assigned reading, and a quote written in larger letters at the top. People don't change because they have to. They change because someone believed they could. She didn't glance at Ryder. She didn't acknowledge the tension his presence once carried. She moved through the material with steady pace, guiding the discussion like a current, not pulling, just flowing. The class wasn't louder, it was clearer. Questions were asked without sarcasm. Answers came without apology. And when Dena paused to take a sip from her thermos, she didn't have to raise her hand for silence. It arrived naturally. At lunch, in the hallway near the sophomore lockers, a freshman boy stood cornered by 2 upperclassmen, backs broad, grins lazy. He wasn't being pushed, not yet, but the moment was bending towards something. Emily rounded the corner, books clutched to her chest, earbuds hanging loose around her neck. She didn't stop walking. She didn't raise her voice. She stepped in without hesitation. Hey, that was it, just the word. But the tone carried something behind it. A line, a weight. The boys turned, saw who it was, and stepped back, not because she was stronger, but because she wasn't alone in the old way anymore. She stood like someone who had learned the difference between silence and surrender. The freshman nodded once, unsure, then walked with her down the hall. Later that day, as the final bell rang and students filed out, Dena stayed at her desk, wiping down the surface with slow, deliberate movements. No rush, no need. She stacked graded papers with care, aligned the notebooks into a clean column, adjusted the chair so it sat centered behind the desk. She didn't look up when Ryder passed by, didn't glance at the hallway camera, didn't check the windows. She just moved with the kind of calm that no longer needed proof. Outside, the wind tugged at the flag. The trees along the sidewalk rustled like old pages turning. Inside, the last of the students left the room. Emily lingered a second longer at the door. She looked at the board, then at the plaque near the front. Strength isn't what you show, it's what you protect. She nodded once, not to anyone in particular, and walked out. Room 3B emptied. But it didn't feel empty. It felt held, because the real change never arrived with applause. It came in the people who stayed, the ones who stepped forward when no one asked them to, the ones who didn't need to win to understand they'd already stopped losing. Dena turned off the light. The room went dark and stayed whole. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.